Hi, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy, and we're going to do a summary, background, and interpretation of The Most Dangerous Game. Hopefully, you read that with me, and hopefully, had a good time. I certainly did. So let's start out with what happened. Rainsford lands on an island controlled by General Zaroff. You recall that he fell off a yacht. He was going to hunt jaguars with Whitney. Rainsford, and they are both hunters. Hunters, not hungers. Sorry. But Zaroff had been hunting men. So he offers Rainsford the opportunity to hunt with him, but Rainsford declines, and as a result, he becomes the prey. Rainsford is hunted, and he uses several tricks to elude death. And finally, he confronts Zaroff, and the story ends with Rainsford sleeping in Zaroff's bed after feeding Zaroff to the dogs. What a wonderful action story. But like all classic literature, there's more to it than meets the eye. The Most Dangerous Game was published also called The Hounds of Zaroff. I guess they like The Most Dangerous Game more. Is a short story by Richard Connell, first published in Collier's magazine in 1924. It's a long time ago. But it is one of the most imitated adventure stories ever written. Now, I'm going to go through some of Jimmy's favorites. The Naked Prey. This was with Connell Wilde. He starred and directed in this movie. He was a safari leader who's set out there, and they come across threatening natives. And when the tourists fail to give the natives what they ask for, a deadly hunting game ensues. It's a great movie if you want to watch it. I think there's hardly any music involved. And Connell Wilde does a great acting job and directing job with being pursued by natives. The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger is a adventure hunting story. Arnold has been accused, and he's got to go through a game show, and he survives deadly gauntlet where the execution becomes the primary objective. He goes through the gauntlet, but he's also hunted. There's a movie called Hard Target, directed by John Woo, famous director of action movies, and Jean-Claude Van Damme, where Van Damme is hired to help a woman's missing father find him. And Van Damme learns that her father has been murdered, and he uncovers an organization that offers people the opportunity to hunt fellow human beings. Sound familiar? Rambo. This is a very famous movie. In fact, if you saw the original Rambo, even some of the succeeding chapters, you'll find out that Rambo uses many, if not all, of the techniques used in The Most Dangerous Game. Especially in the first Rambo, he definitely uses the technique of the pit with the little spikes on the bottom. And also, the one I didn't mention is Predator, where Arnold Schwarzenegger uses I think it's the Malayan, whatever. Maybe it's not the Malayan tiger one, but the other one where he's got a big piece of dead wood coming down on the person. And in fact, that's how he injures the predator, the alien. Other famous ones include The Hunger Games, which is about hunting people. So there's also an early version, if you want to look it up. In 1932, they made a movie about this story. So again, The Most Dangerous Game is one of the most imitated stories ever, where a man is hunting another man or whatever. Jimmy considers this a classic because of the plot, and many of you, because of the movies, may feel differently. Well, it's not a classic. It's kind of like an action movie, Jimmy. How can that be a classic? Well, some of the great movies or some of the great classic literature are, in fact, movies about violence. The Iliad and the Odyssey are great, because they're about pursuit. In the Iliad, they pursue and they attack Troy because they stole Helen. right? And so the Greeks come and they siege Troy. They lay siege to Troy. But plot can be really boiled down to, before we jump into Aristotle's definition of plot, these are ones to keep in mind because you can pretty much fit any story into this, more or less. Man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself. And sometimes you'll see that man versus man is used in the universal. Man is used in the universal sense, meaning a person. So you might have variations on a theme. So it might be man against men, man against society, a person against society. But plot involves conflict of some sort. So Aristotle said plot is the most important component of tragedy. If you've been reading with me a while and reading my analysis, I will continually harp on this because it's very important to understanding classical literature. This question you got to ask yourself at the beginning is the most dangerous game complex or simple? But before you answer that, keep in mind all plots, whether simple or complex, must be unified, clearly displaying a beginning, a middle, and an end, which this certainly does. And they have to be of sufficient length to represent a course of action. Not too long, because otherwise the people will get bored. So a simple plot, in contrast, it does not include a reversal of action. We're going to talk about what the reversal here is. If you read with me the story, you know immediately what the reversal is, right? The hunter becomes the hunted, and then the hunted becomes the hunter. They switch roles, right? And the plots can be coherent, blah, 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 blah. The most dangerous game, in my opinion, is complex. It's a complex plot because its central focus is fear, right? And the main character undergoes a reversal. He experiences true terror for the first time in his life. That's a big thing that happens to Rainsford. Some of you out there may consider this, Jimmy, you're not right. It's a simple plot. It's just boom, boom, boom. Well, that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion, but hopefully by the time we finish this analysis, I'll prove to you that, in fact, it is complex. These are complex characters. They're not just drawn out and say, hey, look at this guy. So consider first what Whitney and Rainsford are discussing in the beginning of the story. It will be light enough in Rio, promised Whitney. We should make it in a few days, I hope. Because remember, it's pitch black, right? When they're on the yacht, it's totally dark. You can feel, the darkness is palpable. You can feel it. And Whitney says, I hope the Jaguar guns have come from Purdy's. Now, Purdy's, you'll find out, is a British gunsmith, still probably in business, hopefully. I haven't really looked them up recently, but that was a gunsmith in England. We should have some, so he's hoping that the guns for Jaguar guns, special guns, should have some good hunting in the Amazon. Great sport hunting, says Whitney. Great sport. The best sport in the world, says Rainsford. He agrees. And so why? Because if you know Rainsford's a hunter, right? They love hunting. Well, for the hunter, amended Whitney, not for the Jaguar. And here begins the juxtaposition of the hunter and the hunted. So Whitney says, well, it's a good sport. Remember, he said great sport, and he says the best. And then Whitney suddenly changes his mind and says, not for the Jaguar. Don't talk rot, Whitney, says Rainsford. You're a big game hunter, not a philosopher. Who cares how the Jaguar feels? Very important to understanding what happens to Rainsford. And Whitney says, well, maybe the Jaguar does. And Rainsford says, they've got no understanding. And Whitney replies, well, even so, I rather think they understand one thing, fear. The fear of pain and the fear of death. Keep that in mind when we review this. Fear of pain and the fear of death. Fear. Fear is a very important emotion, isn't it? Have you ever really been afraid? if you read stories with me, for example, in 548, when Blake has experienced fear, his tongue swells to twice its size, his knees get weak. Fear is an interesting emotion. What makes you afraid? Rainsford laughed. Nonsense! This is hot weather is making you soft. Whitney, be a realist. The world is made up of two classes, the hunters and the huntees. Luckily, you and I are hunters. Do you think we passed the island yet? Because they're passing this mysterious island that the sailors are afraid of, that they can't see, a lot of superstition around this. Huntees is not a word. I think Rainsford made that up. But there's two classes of people, the hunted and the hunters. Predators and prey. Keep that in mind. And Rainsford believes he and Whitney are hunters. So he doesn't really much care what the jaguar feels, if any of the game that he's hunted in the past. Now, put aside your feelings about hunting. Remember, when we're reading a story, we don't care about what you think. I don't care about what you think, and you shouldn't care what I think. What you want to do is understand the motivations in the story. So in the beginning, which is what we're talking about, the beginning of the story, which is the most important, we're finding out that these two guys are hunters. One's a little more, empathetic. Whitney is a little more empathetic because he says, well, maybe the jaguar is afraid. Whereas Rainsford is more callous and says, who cares what they are? We're hunters and we hunt. But fear is exactly what Rainsford learns as evidenced by his realization. And here's his realization. When he's being chased by Zaroff, Rainsford did not want to believe what his reason told him was true. Reason is an interesting word here too, because fear is emotional. Reason you supposedly can reason yourself out of fear, or you should possess your reasoning. For example, in a boxing match, if an opponent, one of the two guys gets afraid of the other guy, he's guaranteed to lose. So you have to reason yourself out of that. It's a long story. But the truth was as evident as the sun that had now pushed through the morning mists. The general was playing with him. This is after he stalked him up the tree. Remember, Rainsford was hiding in the tree. The general got there, looked up to the tree, but never made it to where Rainsford was hiding, and then just left. And Rainsford realizes that he not only tracked him through the night, and Rainsford, being a hunter, knew how to hide his tracks, but the general found him. And the general was at the place where Rainsford was hiding in the tree, and he was looking up the tree, and just before he got to where Rainsford was hiding, he stopped, looked down, smiled, and walked away. You can reread that for yourself. But as Rainsford reasoned, because he was wondering what the heck was going on, why he didn't just shoot him, the general was playing with him. Rainsford realizes what the general's doing. He's letting him live to fight another day. The general was saving him for another day's sport, and the Cossack was the cat, and he, Rainsford, was the mouse. Then it was that Rainsford knew the full meaning of terror. So, in other words, a mouse feels terror when the cat is around. You think? Oh, no, Jimmy, a mouse is a mouse. We're human beings. We'll feel the terror. Mouse don't feel anything. Well, then why does he run from the cat? He may not be saying, oh, crap, the cat's going to eat me. But he's definitely afraid of the cat. He feels fear. Animals feel fear. They feel. Right? Well, how do you know that, Jimmy? How do you know that? Have you ever been a mouse? No. But we're going to talk about fear and why I believe animals fear. Rainsford the hunter becomes the hunted, and the plot, therefore, is complex and includes a reversal of the situation. The character changes, doesn't he? Don't you think Rainsford changed because of this? Or maybe not. Let's continue our examination. Plot structure. Aristotle says it's important to have a clear beginning, middle, and an end, which this does. He describes the ideal plot as having a beginning that establishes the characters, right? That's what this did, clearly. And it set the stage for action, a middle that develops the conflict and tension, right? That's exactly what this thing does. And in the end, the conflict resolves by providing closure. There is closure at the end. It would be different if if it ended with Rainsford of Zaroff going to sleep. There'd be no closure, right? Or there would be. Depends on what the narrator decides to tell us. So the most dangerous game has such structure. Rainsford lands on the island, finds out what General Zaroff's up to, is forced into the hunt, and survives. While there are subordinate characters, for example, Ivan and Whitney, it's really a man versus man plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Good? Are we good? Good. Jim's going to take a sip of coffee. Oh, hold on. Thank you. Pardon me, narration. Narration is told in the third person. This is outside the story. There's only two types of narration, first and third. First is inside the story, but this is outside the story. The narrator is, now, Jimmy, what about Connell? Isn't he the narrator? No. Connell's not the narrator. It's really the third person narrator. He's just the writer. We don't talk about the writers. Maybe we talk a little bit. But in this case, this is the third person omniscient narrator. You're going to hear that word again in a minute. He's outside the story. So the narrator reveals dialogue. So when you hear a character speaking, it's not inside the story talking to us. It's the third person narrator reporting what the person says. So the actions of the characters are told to us by someone not inside the story. It's, again, the third-person narrator. When he's talking about Rainsford swimming in the ocean and taking his clothes off. By the way, did you notice that? That when he was swimming, when he fell off the yacht and realized he's in the ocean and started swimming, he took off all his clothes. Why did he do that? You know why he did that? It's the Caribbean, so it's not cold. But he did that to be able to swim better and longer. Clothes will weigh you down. They weigh when you're wet, right? You agree with that? So there's something to walk away with. If you fall in the ocean, take your clothes off. It would be totally different if it were a first person. So we hear the third person narrator saying things like Rainsford remembered, Rainsford heard. If it was first person and he were narrating it, he would say, I remembered, I heard, I sat there, I sprang up. But he doesn't. Or if someone else, like Whitney, if he was the narrator, but then the story would end after Rainsford fell off the boat because Whitney kept going with the yacht. So Rainsford did this and that, and you will note that the third-person narrator really follows Rainsford most of the time. That's the interest of the third-person narrator, to follow Rainsford and tell us what Rainsford's doing in relationship to the island when he's there. But he also takes us into General Zaroff, and he tells us a little bit right before the fight with Rainsford, and even before that, when Rainsford landed on the island, the narrator tells us he's exceedingly good dinner, paneled wall. How does he replace Ivan? This is when, after Rainsford killed Ivan, the other quarry had escaped them. He was deliciously tired, he said to himself as he locked himself in. Okay, that's the third-person narrator telling us that. And we have to believe what the narrator says, because the story wouldn't make sense if we don't believe that. So these types of narrators are often called omniscient, godlike. They know all things. They know everything. And they're telling us what they want us to know. Not necessarily all the time what we need to know until they're ready to tell us that. So they're just narrating the story. Well, Jimmy, aren't you just being a fussbutt? Isn't that what Richard Connell, the writer, was talking about that? Hold on a second. Jimmy's going to get a book. So if I look at The Most Dangerous Game in my book, it says, Jimmy, it says by Richard Connell. So isn't he the narrator? Isn't he the narrator? No, he's not. He's just the author. He wrote the story. He's not telling the story. Oh, how do you know that? Well, did you meet a character named Richard Connell? No. Well, he's outside the story. You said he's outside the story, so he's telling us the story as Richard Connell. Okay. If you believe that, that's fine. But you can't believe that because there's no proof. Right? You're either inside or outside. If you're outside, you're the godlike, omniscient narrator. No name. No, you don't need a name. You don't need a name. Well, Jimmy, didn't you use in the past the story of Job from the Bible? And it starts out, Job's a good man. If you don't believe that, well, who wrote the Bible, Jimmy? Well, someone did. Well, they say God did. Did God write the Bible? You can believe what you want to believe about the writer of the Bible. It doesn't matter. If you read the story of Job, stay in the story. Do not go outside that story. You understand? So, the third person narrator narrates the story in the sequence of events, right, including techniques that the narrator uses to tell us the story. Sometimes flashbacks, sometimes whatever. So in this case, the technique that this narrator uses is dialogue, not just narration, but it's dialogue. There's a good deal of dialogue in here, besides action. And then we learn a lot about the characters from what they say and what they do. Got it? Any questions? Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. There's 8,011 words in this story, which means it's classified as a short story, which range between 1,500 and 7,500. Well, it's over 7,500, Jimmy. Can't you count? Of course I can count. But it's a short story, right? We read it in a couple of readings. It's not like Hamlet, where we read every scene. It's long, right? The average short story is there, and in stories, whether they're short or long, especially in class, every word counts. This is true of long stories, short stories, novels, dramas. In classical literature, every word counts that the narrator is using. Of course, the writer, right, wrote them for the narrator to read to you. The narrator, right? But we don't talk about the writer. Look at the first sentence. This is the first sentence of The Most Dangerous Game. Off to the right, hyphen, there's a pause. Somewhere. Remember, when you're reading with your mind's voice, with your reading voice in your head, punctuation becomes critical. If you've studied with me in the past some of these other books, especially like in Alice in Wonderland, the punctuation is very, very important to the understanding and appreciation of the story. So this is the first sentence. And remember, Jimmy has told you all over and over again, the first sentence, first page, first paragraph, in anything, story, literature, novel, drama, is the most important. So in this case, off there to the right, and there's a dash, which means a pause, somewhere, another pause, is a large island, said Whitney. It's rather a mystery. Double pause, pause. There's only 17 words in that sentence. You can count them. And Whitney, who's a minor character, notes there's an island somewhere to the right, a mystery island. The word mystery is there for a reason. The narrator didn't have to use it. The writer didn't have to write it. But he used it. Imagine Whitney saying there's just an island over there, or adding, if you just add one word, if you just add that word to this sentence, mystery, it puts us on our toes. It makes us now it's not just an island, and it's not just a large island, it's a mystery island. You see what I'm saying? But isn't Whitney narrating this then? The answer? No. The third person narrating is telling us what Whitney said. And like all third person narrations, we have to believe it. And we do. Because after all, Rainsford lands on the mystery large island. So having read the story, you can clearly see that the island was a mystery, wasn't it? I mean, it fooled Rainsford. Who knew that there was a chateau on the island with electricity? So we go on listening to the two men talk, and we get introduced to Rainsford, who turns out to be one of the main characters when he falls off the boat. So Rainsford says, "What island is it?" And then Whitney says, "The old charts call it Ship Trap Island." Ship Trap Island, modifying ship trap. It traps ships. A suggestive name, isn't it, says Whitney. Sailors have a curious dread. Curious, it's a dread. When you dread something, but in this case, it's not just dreading it, it's a curious dread. Strange dread. I don't know why, says Whitney. I don't know why they dread it so much. Some superstition. There's a beautiful word. That sounds like superstition. Pause. See that? See the double dash? Some superstition. So there's a pause. In other words, Rainsford doesn't react right away. He just some superstition. And then there's a pause in the dialogue. When the narrator's narrating and using punctuation, it's very important to use that in your reading voice in your head. "Can't see it," remarked Rainsford, trying to peer through the dank tropical night. Look at that. It's not just night, and it's not just a tropical night. It's a dank tropical night that was palpable. You could feel it as it pressed its thick, warm blackness upon the yacht. Ooh. And Whitney says, "Well, you've got good eyes," with a laugh. He's laughing at him. He says, "I can't see it." "Well, you got good eyes. I've seen you pick a moose moving in the brown fall bush at 400 yards. But even you can't see 4 miles or so through the moonless Caribbean night." He's kind of mocking Rainsford. This is very important. You know how long a 400-yard shot is? So a football field is 100 yards times 4 is 400 yards. That's a long way away. Think about that. Whitney is saying that he has seen Rainsford kill a moose moving in the brown fall brush, which means it's camouflage, right? It's fall. But now you can't even see 4 miles or so through the moonless Caribbean night. Now, 4 miles, right, is larger than 400 yards, one would guess, right? But they're on the ocean, don't forget, right? This is the Caribbean Ocean. It's the sea. And you should be able to see something, but you can't see 4, right? You can't see your hand in front of your face sometimes. We're learning Rainsford is an exceptional hunter, an important point in the story. Don't you agree? So let's return to the plot for a moment. Do you see how every word counts? Isn't this beautifully written? Unity of action. Aristotle says for a successful plot, it should have a single unified theme and the conflict that drives the narrative forward. All the events and elements should contribute to the theme. So this is interesting because sometimes Google confuses theme, right, with other things like plot. We know the conflict is General Zaroff and Rainsford are hunters, and Rainsford refuses to hunt men. He becomes the hunted. But what do you think the theme of this story is? What's the theme, the central point that you want to walk away with? Does it even have a theme? Well, maybe one of the themes is maybe you're not as smart as you think. Or don't forget what a jaguar feels like. All right? So you start thinking, does it have a theme? Of course it does. But before you settle on the theme you think it means, let's continue. Because plot has character development. Now, one of the things you may say, well, Jimmy, I walked away when I said, okay, to hunt men. Well, I don't know if that's the theme. That's not the theme. One of the themes is be careful what you wish for. Maybe, maybe not. Aristotle emphasizes the importance of well-developed characters who undergo change and grow. That's very important, character development. And we see that in here. We see, especially with Rainsford, that this character undergoes growth, right? They're both hunters. They stay hunters. But Rainsford changes when he becomes the hunted, doesn't he? He has a shift from the beginning when he's talking to Whitney, and there's the hunters and the huntesses, or huntess, whatever he said. The hunted and the hunter, the predator and the prey. He does change. In fact, one of the things Jimmy asked, is he going to take Zaroff's place on the island now that Zaroff is dead? I'm just asking. Because the island is a hunter's paradise. Oh, what do you mean, Jimmy? Hunting? You can't just go around murdering, like Rainsford says. Well, Zaroff's a murderer. He's not a murderer. Isn't he? Or is he? I'm not saying I'm an animal rights guy, right? And I don't care if you are or not. But when you hunt a jaguar with a Purdy rifle, the jaguar doesn't have much of a chance because he's got no rifle. It reminds me of the movie The Untouchables with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner. That was his first movie, I believe. In The Untouchables, when they're talking in the church and they're trying to figure out how to get Al Capone, if he brings a knife, you bring a gun. If you bring a gun, you bring a shot, whatever. And then in a later scene, one of the guys tries to kill Sean Connery, and Sean Connery tells Kevin Costner, well, he made a mistake. He brought a knife to a gunfight. Jimmy, you're talking silly. No, think about it. If you're talking conflict, if you're talking you versus someone else, you versus nature, if you go out in the cold, we're going to read a story soon by Jack London, and you're not prepared, nature going to whoop your butt. It's going to whoop your butt. I'm telling you right now. It's going to whoop you. Quickly, if you go out and it's cold, really cold, like 26 below zero, like it is in Chicago sometimes, where Jimmy grew up, and you're not prepared, it's gonna, and something happens and you can't get to shelter, it's gonna wreak havoc. Anyway, Rainsford changes, and forget about him taking Zaroff's place for a moment, but you heard the saying, the thrill of the hunt. Is man an animal to be hunted? That's one of the questions you have to ask yourself. Some of you will say yes. Some of you will say no. Most of you will probably say no because you haven't thought it through. So let's pause for a moment. What does Google say? Humans are animals, since there are some similarities with other animals. Humans are more evolved than other organisms that belong to Animalia. Humans are placed in the verbatim class Mammalia. Mammals. We're mammals. Humans are members of the order of primates. That's why they study chimpanzees. Did you ever watch? Netflix is streaming Chimp Empire. Watch that. You'll see how human-like chimps are, or should I say how chimp-like we are. Planet of the Apes. Oh, Jimmy, you're really going crazy here. Well, think about it. We're animals. And if you say, I am not an animal, like Charlton Heston said in Planet of the Apes, we are. We just try not to act. Some people are animals, aren't they? Think about motivations of the characters. They're both hunters. They get a thrill. You cannot deny this from the story. A hunting for these two guys is a thrill. Right? Rainsford draws a line on the type of animals he hunts. But Zaroff crosses the line to include human beings. It's a stark contrast, one that people may or may not think about all the time, right? So let's talk about logic for a moment. Is that logical that if men are animals, you can hunt them? In logic, they use syllogisms. Syllogism is a logical argument that applies deductive reasoning to arrive at a conclusion based on two propositions that are asserted, that are said, this is this, and they're assumed, remember the word assumed, to be true. For example, right? Mammals are animals. Elephants are mammals. Elephants are animals. Would you agree with that? Of course you would. This is this, and you could say R equal, equal, equal. In the story, the logical syllogism might be humans are animals, men hunt animals, men hunt humans. Well, Jimmy, you changed R to hunt. Well, humans hunt animals, I could put it that way, right? Men hunt animals, men hunt humans. Humans are animals. I could just flip that. Maybe that's a better way to say it. Men hunt animals. Humans are animals. Men hunt humans. That's a better way to say it, isn't it, than when I wrote it? Say it any way you want. That's logic. But logic infers that these propositions, these assertions are true. Well, you can immediately start poking holes. Not all men hunt animals. Men being the universal men. Not all people hunt animals, right? There's a scene in Hombre, the movie with Paul Newman, where they're in a stagecoach, and he's lived with the Indians his whole life, and he had to go into town because he was left a building, and he wants no part to do. He wants anything to do with civilization. He wants to go to town, sell the house, and get back to the reservation. Now, he's a white guy that lived with the Indians his whole life. So they're in the coach, and the guy who stole all the money was the Indian counselor or whatever they called him in those days with his wife. And they were talking about the reservation, and Paul Newman sitting in the stagecoach just listening to this stuff. And the wife says, they walk around the reservation, and some of the men are striking. They're striking. The handsome men, right? And she said, but they eat dogs. And Paul Newman says, you ever been hungry? And she says, I don't care how hungry I would be. I would never eat a dog. And Paul Newman looks at her very calmly and says, you not only eat the dog, you would fight for the bones. And then her husband says, it sounds like you know Indians. Have you lived on the reservation? He said, yes, I have. He says, in what capacity? He says, I was an officer. I was a law enforcement officer. He was a cop, an Indian cop, but he was a white guy. That scene is representative of what you may or may not do if you're hungry. If you're hungry. There's a great French novel about a guy who stole a piece of bread. It's actually a musical. And then he went to prison for stealing a loaf of bread because he was hungry. If you're really hungry or if you really feel fear, it's amazing what you will or will not do. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding these propositions. And we find out, actually, if you really think about it, that because it's true in a syllogism of logic, it doesn't make it right. I'm not going to get into right and wrong right now. No pun intended. But you have to, you just have to think about these things. Well, I don't want to think about them. Well, you should, because you never know. And if you think it through now, it's good. Jimmy had an Uncle Teddy that fought in World War II. And when Jimmy's mom died, they were sitting around Jimmy's mom's apartment, and he had never heard his uncle talk about the war. And his uncle started telling the story of how he fought in World War II. He was there on D-Day, and he went into, France to fight hedge warfare. They called it bocage, B-O-C-A-G-E, hedge warfare. You can look it up. It was unbelievable. Till today, I can hear my Uncle Teddy was always, to us as growing up, a gentle guy, even though we knew he was in the war. He never really got mad. I never saw him mad. He was a killer. He went into the hedges to kill Germans at night. That was his job. Well, Jimmy, this is not Hedges at Night. Of course, it's a story. But killing is killing, isn't it? Anyway, we don't know much about these characters in the story except through the dialogue, and they're both hunters. Rainsford even, remember this? He wrote a book about hunting. Zaroff happened to have read that book. Zaroff is very refined. Is he crazy for hunting men? Obviously, right? Right? I don't know. Probably. Of course he is. Who hunts men? Who hunts people? Maybe the question we should ask is the hunt a fair game? What does Zaroff have and what does the prey have as a weapon? You see, when Zaroff hunts, if you're going to do this, if you're going to hunt another person and you want to make it a fair game, you can't give him a knife and you keep a gun. You can't do it. It's just not right. Flip it. Give him the gun and you take the knife. You see what I'm saying? At the end, Rainsford feeds Zaroff to the dogs. You know this, right? You understand this? Do you understand the ending of the story? Those dogs? Is Rainsford just as crazy as Zaroff? He switched on the light. There was a man standing behind the curtain. Rainsford, he screamed the general. How in God's name did you get here? Swam, said Rainsford. I found it quicker than walking through the jungle. Smarty pants. The general sucked in his breath and smiled. I congratulate you, he said. You've won the game. Rainsford did not smile. I am still a beast at bay, he said in a low, hoarse voice. Get ready, General Zaroff. The general made one of his deepest bows. I see, he said. Splendid! Exclamation point. Splendid! One of us is to furnish a repast for the hounds, and the other will sleep in this very excellent bed. On guard, Rainsford. And they fight, right? And then the last line of the story, he had never slept in a better bed. Rainsford decided. So he kills Zaroff, right? And he feeds them to the dogs. That's what they say. One of us is to furnish a repast because the dogs haven't eaten. This is the last sentence of the story, how the narrator could have ended the story. Think about that. For example, he could have said, Rainsford had never slept better in a bed. Right? He uses Rainsford at the end. He had never slept in a better bed. It's a small thing. But the pronoun he could have meant what? Zaroff or Rainsford. But he saves Rainsford decided that for the end, just for that little pause, right? That little pause. Excellent storyteller. Causality. There should be causally connected. The most dangerous game meets this criteria that every event flows from one to the other. You understand? There's nothing in here illogical. It just keeps going based on the premise that one guy is hunting another guy. Reversal recognition. We talked about this. The protagonist, Rainsford, right, does have recognition. Here it was. Rainsford knows the full meaning of terror. We went over that. And Zaroff, when he finds Rainsford in the room, experiences a reversal, kind of, because he thinks, well, the game's over, but it's not over. Because Rainsford says it's not over. So he realizes that. He doesn't say, oh, save me. Oh, please, Rainsford, don't kill me. Oh, he doesn't say any of that. He's happy. Look, it's splendid. This is great. One of us will be food for the house. The other is going to sleep in this bed. Let's do it. On guard. Let's dance. There's many theories why prey animals know that they're going to be eaten, or whether they are just dumb animals. If you watch any kind of stories about animals and you watch enough of them, you're going to understand what I just said. There are many theories about whether the prey know they're going to be eaten by the predator. If you've ever watched nature films, especially wolves hunting in packs, there's a moment, and you can research this and read about it and say, I don't believe you, Jimmy. That's fine. But there are actually moments when the prey knows it's over. And he kind of almost accepts his fate. That's not the case with these two guys. None of them accepted their fate as a prey. They were both predators that are going to fight. Right? So they're not neither of these guys become the prey. Rainsford has to be the prey in the beginning because Zaroff is hunting him, but none of them at the end are prey. They're both two predators that are going to fight it out, and Rainsford wins. Okay, so Rainsford used all of his skill and knowledge. Zaroff then becomes the prey. That's the story. It's a beautiful story, well written. I want to just touch on some of the language. This was published, as I mentioned, in 1924. It starts out with dialogue, third-person narration, palpable, very important to define your words. And I want you to look up words you don't know. This is very important. It's important to look up the words when you're reading a story that you don't know. Well, Jimmy, didn't you know what palpable means? Well, even if I did, I made sure I know what it was to tell you what they say it is, and then you figure it out. Can you understand that? Purdy, they talked about the Jaguar guns from James Purdy, is a British gun maker in London, and you can look him up. Long time guy, long time making guns for hunters. Ladies and gentlemen, as much as we like or don't like or admit or don't admit, big game hunting was a big thing at one time. Maybe still is. I don't know. I don't follow it. Maybe it still is. So we talked about the first sentence, the language of the first sentence. We analyzed all this and why it's important. And don't talk rot. This is very important to positioning the story and understanding the deep meaning it has between man versus man, right? And I want you to note the spaces in the story that we were reading. You can go back and reread it if you'd like. But these spaces are not random spaces. They're like chapters in a book. These are techniques that the narrator/writer uses. Jimmy, the narrator is not the writer. Let me correct you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Of course not. But these spaces are not just random spaces. They're there for a pause in the action. After the debacle in Russia, some of you may not know what he's talking about. I put a little question mark there and I said reference. I want you to read with a pen and highlighter all the time as well. So I want you to know that the debacle they're talking about, because Zaroff is Russian, was the Russian Revolution of 1917. So this happened after the debacle, after the revolution in Russia. So we can place the story a little bit better in our own minds on when this is happening. And Zaroff is telling him that nobles lost everything. And they also got, if you know about the Russian Revolution, the Tsar was killed with his family. But I, luckily, had invested heavily in American securities. So I never have to drive a taxi in Paris. So he continued to hunt, and then he talks about how he was bored. He got bored because the animal never had a chance. They were no match at all for a hunter with his wits and a high-powered rifle. Sorry. Of course they weren't. If you're a hunter hunting any kind of animal with a high-powered rifle, unless you're hunting bees, your high-powered rifle ain't going to do nothing. But if you're going to hunt with a high-powered rifle, Jimmy, are you saying that like the Cape buffalo that he talked about in here that put him in a hospital for 6 months? Of course, the animal can win. There's nothing worse than a wounded animal. You know this, right? Or do you know that? If you wound an animal, there's nothing worse than that. That animal is wounded, and he's got nothing to lose by going after you. In any case, not that I'm a hunter. I've never hunted. I fished, but I never hunted. But that's another story. So previous research shows that animals can remember specific events and use tools to solve problems, because they're talking here Rainsford, but no animal can reason. This is right before Zaroff tells him that he hunts men, because he's telling him, I've got a new animal. And the animal must have courage, cunning, and must be able to reason. And Rainsford says, no animal can reason. He says, my dear fellow, there is one that can. And Rainsford's realizing slowly what this guy's talking about. He says, you don't mean, and he says, well, why not? So if you research, can animals reason? Can animals think? Previous research shows animals remember specific events and use tools to solve problems. And if you watch nature shows, an octopus is a very smart sea creature. They learn how to open up jars. Does that mean they think? I don't know. Probably not. But exactly what that means, whether they're making rational decisions or reacting to the environment, remains, everybody debates that, right? They debate that just like they debate the great mysteries of the universe. They debate it. They don't know. How do you know? I never heard a monkey talk. I never heard a parrot talk. And if I did, do they really know what they're saying? Do they really know? But you can't help but look at sometimes in a dog's eyes and realize they're looking at you with deep feelings, including like, I want to eat you, if you look at the wrong stuff. Sir. Okay. These movies I mentioned, The Naked Prey and the others, if you watch those movies, all these traps that Rainsford sets are used in those movies one place or another. And Predator was another movie I didn't mention, or did I mention that? I think I did. I thought of that while I was doing this analysis. Predator, which is an Arnold Schwarzenegger, they used another trick, one that Rainsford used to kill the alien or to wound the alien. And then finally, after General Zaroff realizes that Rainsford jumped into the sea, he basically sings some Madame Butterfly, which you should look up. And I gave you a definition here. It's one of opera's most enduring tales of unrequited love. Puccini's poignant score follows the tragic tale of a young Japanese girl who falls in love with an American naval officer with devastating consequences. It's a sad story. So he sings some of that opera, or he mumbles it, he hums it. But then he goes home, has a beautiful dinner, wonders how he's going to replace Ivan. And then he reads Marcus Aurelius. And of course, and then the end of the story, when Rainsford walks in, they fight, and he loses. But he's reading Marcus Aurelius. I said earlier that every word counts. This is called an allusion. So if you've never read Marcus Aurelius, you don't know what the hell this guy's talking about. Why would a Russian nobleman who left after the revolution in Russia be reading Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman? He was actually a Roman emperor. If you saw the movie Gladiator, Alec Guinness, I think, played Marcus Aurelius. In any case, the book he was reading is really Meditations. And you should read it. Maybe Jimmy will read it with you one day. But I wanted to call some of the quotations from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations in order to put this whole story into context. So one of the things that Marcus Aurelius is a deep thinker, influenced by many philosophers and so on. And if you remember the beginning of the story, Rainsford tells Whitney, you're not a philosopher. Don't talk rot. Remember that when he was saying that the jaguar has feelings? You're not a philosopher. Well, you should be a philosopher. You should think about things around you, animals, plants. So one of the things that Marcus Aurelius wrote was, what is death? And the fact that if a man looks at it in itself and by the abstractive power of reflection resolves into their parts all the things which present themselves to the imagination in it, what's it, death, he will then consider it, what's it, death, to be nothing else than an operation of nature. And if anyone is afraid of an operation of nature, he is a child. this is one of the most profound meditations, in my opinion, that Marcus Aurelius made about death. This story is about death. This story is about how both of these guys, I don't know if Zaroff fears death. He just is taking pleasure in killing things. But certainly Rainsford, who probably at the beginning of the story didn't think much of it, didn't think twice because he's never been a jaguar. But he learns through being hunted what terror is, what fear is. But then at the end, he just does what a predator does, right? He throws Zaroff to the down. But Marcus Aurelius is thinking about this, and if Zaroff read this, it's an operation of nature, and that explains why he shouted "Splendid! Let's dance, let's do it." Another quote is, remember that all, A-L-L, all is opinion. What does that mean? Well, Jimmy, what about mathematics? 2 and 2 are 4. Well, maybe on Earth. but if you leave the planet, maybe it's not. And I've worked for guys who say 2 and 2 are 5. What do you mean, Jimmy? I mean, some bosses have a horrendous ego, and they tell you, if I say it's this way, it's this way. I've got fired over that type of thinking. That's another story. How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only to what he does himself, that it may be just and pure. So don't look at what other people are doing. Just watch yourself and make sure what you're doing is just and pure, right? Don't look at the Joneses. Well, isn't that a recent saying, Jimmy? The Joneses? Keeping up with the Joneses? Marcus Aurelius lived way a long time ago. What did they say? 166? Yeah, around here. He wrote Meditations in 166. So that's a long time ago. And that's what he wrote. That's his meditation. Meditations were written, he was thinking to himself about life, right? Observe constantly that all things change, and accustom thyself to consider that the nature of the universe loves nothing so much as to change the things which are and to make new things like them. For everything that exists is in a manner the seed of that which will be. But thou art thinking only of seeds which are cast into the earth or into the womb, but this is a very vulgar notion. Don't just think about these as if you're growing a plant. This is nature. This is the universe. This is everything. You understand? Change. Everything changes, not just from a seed. Time is like a river made up of events which happen and a violent stream, for as soon as a thing has been seen, it's carried away, and another comes in its place, and this will be carried away too, and on and on and on and on. There was a Greek philosopher, remember Marcus Aurelius was Roman, so they learned a lot from the Greeks. Heraclitus said, all things are a flowing, comparing life to all the events in your life. They flow. Everything changes. Nothing stays. Well, Jimmy, isn't there such a thing as history repeats itself? Yeah, of course. But nothing much changes, right? Oh, sure it does. You just said it does. Of course it does. It changes. Or does it? See, I'm challenging you to think these things through. I'm going to leave you with one more quote. This is a long one. I don't know if I'll read it all. I'm going to leave it up here, and you can pause the recording and read it yourself. But in the morning when you rise, he says, unwillingly, I got to get up. Have you ever felt like that? Ah, crap, I don't want to get up. Let this thought be present. When you feel like that, Marcus Aurelius is saying, think about this. I am rising to the work of a human being. And why then am I dissatisfied if I'm going to do things for which I exist and for which I was brought into the world? Or have I been made for this, to lie in bedclothes and keep myself warm? Remember, Jimmy has a saying, right? that he gets up to. A day without work is a day without food. You're here for a reason. What is that reason? To lie in bed and stay warm? Please. Dost thou exist then to make thy pleasure and not at all for the action or exertion? Do you not see the little plants, the birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees working together to put order into their universe? Have you ever watched nature? A bird doesn't say, I think I'm going to stay in the nest today. I feel a little crappy. Sorry. You got to make the most of it. Get off your butts, ladies and gentlemen. No, whatever. And such men, when they have violent affection to a thing, choose neither to eat nor sleep, nor rather than to be firm. See, they get obsession, right? Obsession. Read this when you get a chance. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is an analysis of The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. Hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you stuck with me. I hope you go back and reread it. Share it with your friends. Email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself. Remember, get out of bed. Do something.